here we are, back for another Openings Explained lecture. I'm Nick Risko, your instructor for tonight, and one of the instructors here at the St. Louis Chess Club. And tonight we're going to be doing a part 2 to the Rossolimo attack, which we were talking about last week. Very theory-heavy lecture. Was talking almost the entire time. Tonight's going to be a lot lighter. We may not even fill up the whole hour, so if you have any questions from the last lecture or from tonight, make sure to drop them in the chat. I'll try and get to them at the end. So tonight we're going to be going over the e6 lines in the Rossolimo attack, where if you're not familiar, it starts off with pawn to e4 and pawn to c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and the Rossolimo is bishop to b5. And like we were talking about last week, this is probably the best theoretical alternative to the open Sicilian. And last week we were talking about g6, we were talking about knight to f6, talking about what if black goes pawn to d6 and tries to get some variation of the Moscow. But tonight we're going to be focusing on the move pawn to e6 because the plans for this are going to be a little bit different than all of the others. It's a little bit more unique, and it would be good for us to make sure we cover the plans. So let me make sure I switch to the right chapter here. So here we go, bishop to b5 and pawn to e6. Now, just to recap, the idea behind bishop to b5 is that white is putting his bishop on a square where, one, he's developing it and ready to castle on the next move if so desires, but also the way the knight is here, without d6 being played, white is setting up to capture the knight and double black's pawns and hopefully get an advantage off of the pawn structure. Why is playing e4, e5 like openings as white against the Sicilian so bad? It was a question from Cameron Bruce. So one of the reasons why you can't always play the same setups is because with e5 they're making a direct contest for the center, and here with c5 they're challenging the center from the flank. So the ideas are different between the two systems that black has. So there's no one universal chess opening. Otherwise we'd only have one lecture for openings explained, and that would be it. So here we are looking at what happens if white goes bishop to b5 and black goes e6, and we'll go on to white's moves here. There are three kind of ideas that I have here that branch off from this position immediately. We're first going to take a look at the move knight to c3. And this seems very logical. You just keep developing your pieces. And this is also going to be helping stop black's main idea here. The reason why black is going to go e6 is so they can try and get a d5 push and recapture with the pawn, make a bigger fight for the center compared to like g6, which is the main line where you're going to be attacking the center from far away. So knight c3 just develops. It's also getting a little bit more control on the d5 square here. And black is going to go knight g to e7, and one of the ideas is if white takes on c6, then they can recapture with the knight, and then they won't have doubled pawns on the c file. We'll see white castle, again, quick castle after the minors are developed, and after pawn to a6 here, we can captures, and then play pawn to d4, strike in the center, try and open it up a little bit. White is a little bit ahead in development here with two knights out and castles, while black has made a lot of pawn moves, and white's trying to ask black, what's your idea here? Once I break in the center, I'm going to have a lot of development. What do you have to show for it? Just like most Sicilians, black is going to capture, open up the c file for himself later during the game. Knight recaptures, and queen c7. And in this line, it kind of transposes to a Taimanov Sicilian, but the difference here is white has greater than normal development. The trade-off is that white also doesn't have their light squared bishop. So this is an idea for black, but not the main line here, but you guys should be aware of it. One of the other ideas here is capturing on c6 right away. And the idea is you're forcing black to choose what way they're going to recapture, and depending on what way they're going to recapture is going to influence the game. Now, tonight we're going to be looking at b takes c6. I decided not to look at d takes because it doesn't really follow with the themes I'm following for black here. If they take with the d pawn, then they don't get to play d5 later. But normal development should suffice for white here, just castles, and you'll play something like d3, c3, you get your bishop to e3, knight d2, Very simple developing moves, shouldn't need to think so hard because black is not actively fighting for center control here. But we'll look at the pawn b takes. Oh, jumping around here a little bit. B takes. And white now has two options here as well. We're going to start off with a little bit of a sideline here that can lead to an interesting trap for black to fall into, for white to take advantage of. And that is the move here, pawn to b3. The idea is you're going to try and put your bishop on b2, put some pressure on this a1 to h8 diagonal, have a very nice long range for this bishop. And here, black can go d6, try and, I guess, open up some of the center for the bishop. You're kind of trapping your dark square bishop, but what else is there really to do? You want to solidify your center. We can see pawn to e5, setting up a trap, and the idea is if black takes, white can take back, and black may have thought ahead and been like, well, wait, white can't take here because queen to d4 is a fork. So we'll give a second for the chat to see what the move is here. I'm not entirely sure how well known this trap is, so I don't know how quick you guys will get it, but I do want you guys to try and see if you can find the right move here for white to continue. Musa20 is saying pawn to c3. If pawn to c3, what are you going to do against queen takes e5 with check? It's going to be a little bit of a problem here. All right, so we're getting a few more people in the chat here. Sandro Shock is in here saying bishop to b2. And this is the move, this is the trap that black can fall for. Your bishop develops to b2 anyway, and it defends the knight. And you're probably like, Nick, that you're losing the bishop. Yeah, we have people in the chat here saying bishop b2 loses to queen takes b2. But you guys have to calculate more than one move ahead. You know, yes, the bishop is hanging, but now we have a follow-up move. We'll see if you guys can find the continuation. This is going to be seeing if Sandro Shock specifically knows this trap, see if they see the follow-up, and hopefully we'll get Arthas his answer to why queen takes b2 is inadequate. Yeah, we're getting it in the chat here. Knight to c3 is the trap. And once we take a look at it, white did give up the bishop on b2. But when you look at the position of black's pieces, specifically the queen has almost nowhere to go. The only escape square is a3. And here if you try queen to a3, well then you're met with the finishing move, queen to f3. And the idea is you are threatening to come down with some mating ideas, like take on f7 with the queen and take on f8. You can't just take on f7 and go to d7 because of the bishop on c8. But you are threatening queen takes f7, and in addition, you are threatening queen takes c6, where now that even though you've given up the bishop, this fork is going to result in you winning a rook. So you're going to be gaining an exchange here, and white stands much better. I guess the only move where white has really faltered, at least in the database I'm using, the lead chess database, knight e7, and white has faltered here, but just taking on f7 with either the queen or knight is going to give white an advantage based off of initiative and just the fact that black's king is being harassed. So there is a little trap there that if you're unfamiliar with, if you're playing with the black pieces, or if you're trying to play some funny moves with white, this is something you can try out in Blitz. I don't know how well it would hold up in a classical tournament after bishop to b2. Your opponent might know what's going on, and they can just go like queen e4 check. And you probably have to give up your right to castle. If you try going queen to e2, there's queen takes g2, and probably just even trading on e2 shouldn't be too horrible for black. So, nice little trap again. I don't know how well it would hold up in classical, but in Blitz, definitely a surprise weapon here. And like I said, that's not the main line, that's just one of the side lines. The main line here is to castle. So after, you know, bishop takes right away and the b pawn takes, you castle. And now black normally follows up with d5 right away. You can go d5 right away, and white can just defend their center. The idea is if black takes, you can take right back. And after a queen trade, white is doing completely fine. They still have space here on the king side. They have development. They already have an entire file. So black doesn't really want to take here. Instead, they'll defend with something like knight to f6. You can get pawn to e5 hitting the knight, and after knight to d7, your knight is safe. You're putting pressure on the pawn. So white over defends. And now after bishop to e7, black's going to castle short. And then white is going to continue with moves, probably like c4 or bishop f4. And even knight to c3 is fine here. But going d5 right away is definitely an idea for black. The other idea that I want to focus on is knight to e7, which is the other idea of why e6 is played. So your g knight can go to e7, get some more control over the center. And the problem here, though, is that you're blocking your dark square bishop, which just means it's going to take longer for you to castle. So something like knight g6 is going to be played, and then bishop to e7, and then castle short. You're not going to want to castle queenside. Don't even think about it. With these pawns missing on b7, there's just this huge hole. I don't see how you're going to stop something like pawn to c3 and queen a4 effectively. So white will go pawn to b3, and again we see this idea of fianchettoing the queenside bishop for easier development. We get knight to g6, bishop to b2, hitting the g-pawn, which means that black can't exactly develop the bishop right away. If they try and go bishop to e7, just bishop takes g7, taking the pawn, rook to g8, and after the bishop goes back, I'm not sure what black is gaining after giving up this pawn. So if your opponent's not careful and they try and develop and castle, you can just ruin that plan by taking on g7. So instead of doing that, black should probably play the move pawn to d5. And this is a move that I took a look at, and it's definitely not played as much. I think this is probably one of the best tries, just fighting for the center right away. White should defend the e-pawn. And now black can go pawn to f6. Now again, we're kind of ignoring Ben Feingold's general rule of never play f6. This is making sure that the bishop cannot take on g7. So it's limiting the bishop's scope, and also preparing for something like, bishop e7 and castle short, or you might even try and consider king f7, going rook f8 later, and king to g8 and castling by hand. So f6, while it may look like your opponent's ignoring general rules, this is not too terrible for black here. After something like pawn to e5 to try and break up the pawns, try and give life back to this bishop, bishop to e7, just defending f6. Now we'll see both sides just develop their pieces to kind of natural squares. This knight does come to a4 to put pressure on c5. And here we see black castle finally. And we see pawn to d3. White's going to probably put the queen on d2 and try and get some sort of pressure going along the diagonals here. But after something like f takes e5, where the pawn's protected, I think black has a bit of an advantage here. Nothing too crushing. You know, a lot of doubled pawns here in the center, but this is a nice pawn center for black. I don't think this is too terrible for black at all. Again, probably slightly better. But just an idea. If they don't go d5 right away, the other ideas that have been tried is pawn to f6 right away. So pawn to f6 has been tried, but is met with either e5, trying to break it up right away. This was played, I think, in 2002 against Quartas Golko in one of the Olympiads. Yeah, the 2002 Olympiad. And really, white just got regular development. Here they get knight to d2. There's no need for them to go knight c3 and a4. They can just go d2, make sure this bishop's still on the diagonal. This is fine. And queen c7. And here you have a chess game. If they don't try f6, the other idea that's been tried is bishop to e7. But this, like I said, is bad just because it hangs the pawn. So not good enough. So that's kind of what can happen if white captures right away. Now let's take a look at some of the other ideas white has. They don't need to capture. We already looked at knight to c3, so I guess it's time to look at the main line with castles. Okay. So castles, kingside, and black has a few ideas, but the one we're going to be looking at is knight g to e7. Again, one of the reasons e6 is played. I want to make sure I get that point across. Your opponent is playing e6 to go knight e7 and play d5. And here, again, white has a few different branches they can go down. Here, c3 is an idea. This is one of the major variations that black should be aware of, where after pawn to a6, the bishop goes to a4, and then you see pawn to b5 hitting the bishop, and it comes back to c2, kind of something that's not quite unlike the Ruy Lopez. And we see bishop to b7. Speaking of the Ruy Lopez, it looks like Nibris is asking if I have any plans to teach the Ruy Lopez. I don't have any currently, maybe in the distant future, but I have a bunch of other openings lined up for the next few weeks. But okay, bishop b7, and we have quite a few moves in here that are theory. We'll see black trying to expand in the center, white kind of clamp it down with pawn to e5, black trying to bust through, and white is going to get this bishop active on e4. So a lot of moves with the light squared bishop, but they all come with a purpose, all come with pressure, and then the queenside pieces are going to develop later. Again, something that's not too unlike a Ruy Lopez or a Gioco Pianissimo. So I'll go through the rest of the moves here just for illustrative purposes. Not going to be looking at them too terribly deep tonight, just because last week we did go over a lot of theory. But we see a lot of trades in the center. But both sides eventually get all their pieces developed. And here we enter almost an endgame where white is slightly better, but both sides have bishop pairs. It's just that black has this isolated queen's pawn that's going to be a target. So white is slightly better here in the endgame, but something black needs to be worried about, or not worried about, just be aware of, that c3 is a move here. Another idea that's been tried is knight to c3 here, and the difference between this position and the previous position is that this knight is on e7 and this bishop is still on b5. And after knight to d4, this maneuver we looked at a lot last week and variations where it didn't work, but here it does seem to work for black. You capture on d4, capture on d4, and here you just go knight to e2, putting pressure on the pawn. a6, getting tempo off the bishop, bishop goes back. Knight to c6, you might be tempted to go b5 here, but I don't see what black is really gaining out of this. Bishop b3, and maybe you're looking for the plan of bishop to b7, but d3 just holds on, and you're going to have to move this knight anyway to develop your bishop. So I think if you just go knight to c6 here, leaving this capture open, this capture is going to help black because they can bring a pawn closer to the center to break through. Pawn to d3, bishop to c5, just holding on to the pawn. And then pawn to c4 has been played in the game Watson-Nunn from 1996, where black continued rook to b8, which is a bit of a mistake. The bishop develops with tempo. The pawn has to come to d6. And this dark square bishop really, I'm really wishing it could be doing more for black here. It's really not doing much, kind of looking like a tall pawn. Not really having much control over the position. After pawn to b4, bishop b4, knight takes d4. White has a better game because they just traded off a b pawn for a center pawn, or rather the c pawn, but the c pawn was influencing the center, so I'm considering it a center pawn here. And white ended up going on to have a serious advantage here. So knight c3 is an interesting idea here as well. But we're going to look at the main line now, rook to e1. And the idea here is just reinforce this e4 pawn. Maybe you're going to drive it up to e5 later. And I guess one of the main ideas is if they go d5 here, you're okay capturing because now you're opening up the file for your rook, and this shouldn't be a problem for white at all. The knight should probably take, because if you take with the pawn, this is going to be annoying. The knight is not really defending the knight on c6, and knight to e5 is even a possibility here. Not the best move. Breaking open with d4 and just expanding, opening up lines for the rest of your pieces for rapid development is going to be the way to go, but I'm just demonstrating some of the problems with capturing with the pawn. This pin can be very annoying. So you shouldn't go d5, you go a6 and hit the bishop. and now we see the bishop come to f1. So I guess the general idea is that when they play a6, if you're able to bring the bishop to f1, you might want to preserve the bishop, keep the bishop pair. If you can't go bishop to f1 and the choice is taking on c6 or going to a4, it seems like in most of these lines, you just capture. Capturing isn't going to be too terrible for white in most of these lines. I couldn't find a line where black just like blows white out of the water if they capture. So if you can go bishop f1, I'd say go for it. If you can't, then trading on c6 is fine. But here, bishop f1 is possible. And now we have pawn to d5. I do have a note on bishop takes here. I know I was just saying taking shouldn't be too bad. Here is one of the slight exceptions. If you take on c6 now, it's helping black play d5 earlier. I forgot about this, where after the b pawn takes, just d5 is coming. And if you capture, the second c pawn is going to recapture. So my apologies, I didn't catch my note there. This is one of the exceptions. Bishop to f1 and pawn to d5 breaking open in the center, getting that space, and now giving the true contest. And now all of black's moves are making sense for why they played e6 and knight to e7. Again, white should capture, open up the file for the rook, knight takes, and then pawn to d4, trying to get that space back, make another challenge in the center. They shouldn't concede it too early. We see the knight go back to f6. What exactly is the reason behind this? Black could capture, and after knight captures, you can make a few developing moves. This is fine, but I think one of the main ideas behind knight to f6 here is probably just to keep an eye on the center squares. In case of pawn comes, I think this push, giving white this option, is going to help. And then also maybe get your bishop onto d6, but you really want to get some pressure on this pawn, it looks like. Bishop to e3 just to defend it, and then bishop e7 developing. And here is just a couple more moves of the main line here. Just pawn to c4, expanding in the center. You're going to be castling as black. Knight to c3, captures, captures. And after knight to e5, not allowing a trade for white. I don't think that would be too great for either side. Black should just go to e5, keep the pieces on the board, start maintaining the pressure, and then you're going to get your bishop out in the future. But this is the main line of e6 in the Rossolimo attack, and this was kind of everything we didn't get to cover last week. I know this was a lot shorter, only about half an hour instead of our full hour here, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't leave you guys hanging with this major variation for black. So I'm going to open up our time here to the chat on any questions you have in the Rossolimo. Maybe we'll branch off and talk about other openings generally, but this is really just an open floor for you guys now since we covered all the lines for the Rossolimo. I think we also have people checking us out on Twitch tonight, but I don't see any comments in the Twitch chat. Let's look through the YouTube chat here. Talk on the Najdorf Sicilian. I would talk about the Najdorf if Caleb Denby didn't do a crazy 10-part series on it. So I'm not going to talk about the Sicilian Najdorf. We have a whole 10-part series. Once this goes up on YouTube, I'm sure Ben or Danny or someone can include a link to that. But yeah, we have a bunch of videos on the Najdorf. I'm not going to talk about it. Sandra Schock, why isn't there a German opening? I don't know. I'm not the guy who names the openings. I'm just the guy who talks about them. Make a video on the Gioca piano. I might do that. The Italian is one of the openings I've been looking at to talk about, but it does have a bit more theory than all the ones we've talked about. That might be one we have to split up into a couple nights like this. Is there anything on the Rossolimo, though? I want to make sure we get all the Rossolimo questions. Please mention the link of Najdorf. I did. It's a 10-part series on our YouTube page. I wish I had the playlist link memorized, but I don't. Just look up Caleb Denby Najdorf, and then I'm sure one of the parts will pop up. But this is not This is not a Najdorf lecture tonight. Okay, here we go. E-King Master Puppets. What is to be done with the bishop on f1? Good question. So this bishop on f1, definitely not as active as other positions you'll see the light squared bishop in, such as the Italian or the Ruy Lopez, where either it's helping to attack on f7 or it's helping support the center positionally. Here on f1, the bishop is guarding the c4 pawn, which is going to probably be black's next target. Excuse me. Be black's next target after probably bishop to d7 and rook to c8. b3 will solidify this overall, but the bishop is also preventing a b5 expansion from black. So this bishop is really not going to see any play soon, but later, maybe after maybe 2 sets of minor pieces, maybe a pair of rooks come off the board, something like g3 and bishop to g2, this bishop is going to have massive control over the center. You can probably even do this as soon as probably even this position. Let's check it out here. What happens if I go g3 in this position? It looks like after g3 right away, one of the knights can go to g4, and they're trying to take on e3. So maybe g3 right away isn't going to work. Maybe pawn to h3 to keep these knights away. And then, like I said, later you're going to probably go g3 and bishop g2 is probably going to be an easy way to get it out. But if you rush it too soon, you might experience some weaknesses on the king side. Like I said, you probably want to trade off some sets of minor pieces first. So very nice question there. Thank you for the compliments, Nebris. It's always a pleasure to give these lectures. Hey Buddy is asking for theory on the Bong cloud. I might have ideas with that. So keep your eyes out over the next few weeks. Can I expand on ideas in the middle game for this opening? So at least for the e6 lines, which, like I said, we're focusing on tonight, black is going to try and go for that d5. Once they get d5 and make that fight for the center, you might see some liquidation like this. But like we were just looking at, in the long term, white might be trying to trade off some minor pieces, maybe a set of knights, to I guess ease up some of the pressure, so that way it gives more flexibility for your light square bishop to move around. If we were to play a game from this position, what would I be expecting? As white, I almost want to go b3 just to make sure I don't have any problems with the c-pawn, but that may run into bishop to b4. So maybe I just go queen to b3 and try and target the queenside pawns here as well. But it's hard to give a direct approach to the position. And then for all the other lines in the Rossolimo, we did cover those and the main plans for those in our last lecture. Is the Carlsen-Caruana match a good example to learn the Rossolimo? I would say when you have the number 1 and 2 chess players in the world playing any chess game, I think it's going to be good to take a look at to see the plans for both sides, especially if all of the games ended in draws. Usually draws are going to be the highest quality chess games, just because both sides are playing very well. I think any games by them are going to be worth taking a look at. What is the best Sicilian defense variation for black? Is the question by, was it Devantgarj? I hope I'm saying that correctly. I have my personal opinions. I'm going to be a dedicated dragon player for probably as long as I live. But if you play any Sicilian variation, then you run a Lee chess analysis on it, it'll tell you any move other than a6 is dubious. But the Najdorf is probably going to be the best variation. Definitely the most respected, and probably the reason why most players would avoid the open Sicilian and play openings such as the Rossolimo here and avoid all that theory. So another good question from the YouTube chat. Okay, I'm popping back over to the Twitch chat. I see some people type in here. Ilmadato is asking, when is it good to play bishop takes c6 for white? Like I said, usually it doesn't hurt white too much, What you do want to avoid is in these e6 lines. Like I said, there was that one exception we had earlier. Where did it go? I want to find it. Where did it go in my notes? Here we go. So in the line where if you don't capture right away, you play castles, and then they play knight ge7 and rook to e1. They play a6. Here, you don't really want to capture on c6 because after b captures, they get a quick d5, and they get to challenge you in the center right away. So if you can go bishop f1, you'd rather go bishop f1. Otherwise, taking on c6 shouldn't pose a great problem. I don't think it was ever a real problem in any line other than e6. But yeah, when e6 is played, you do want to be a little cautious and make sure black can't just get this expanse in the center right away. So yeah, that should answer what looks to be probably the only question from the Twitch chat. Looks like YouTube has more here. Is f4 an option to pressure the e5 knight? So I'm assuming that's going to be about the final position. Knight e5. Is f4 an option? What do I think of it immediately? Immediately, I think f4 is a little too aggressive. Let's see. If we go f4 right away, this has been played before, but it looks like black gets a serious advantage after going knight to g4 here, and then threatening to take probably what is white's better bishop. Usually in most Sicilians, this dark square bishop for white is its superstar, probably the best minor piece on the board, and here black is just threatening to trade it off. And you can't exactly just move it back, it looks like. If you try moving it back to c1, we don't want to go to d2 and just give this knight away for free. They can come in with e5, it looks like, and expand. If you take, we run into bishop c5, and we're going to be losing this knight. If we take on f6, then bishop d4 check, and now knight f2. So one thing I don't like about f4 is that it makes bishop to c5 a lot stronger. So yeah, knight g4, and then whatever you do, like bishop c5, just pinning the knight is going to be very strong. So I don't think f4 is going to be the play here. I think just playing it slowly. This knight really isn't doing anything to hurt your position too much, other than trying to go to g4. So like I said, h3 is going to probably be my recommendation here. And just play it slow and safe. There's no need to be over aggressive and try and shoo these knights away, and you might run into some trouble if you try and force things from your opponent. Let's see, is this Jean-Michel Royer, maybe? Again, I'm horrible with pronouncing names. Question has nothing to do with this. Do you think anybody can reach 2,000 if they put in the work? I think most people can reach Class A, maybe experts, if they put in the work, really just focusing on not hanging your pieces. It's at least something that most of my friends who are masters say. I'm not a master myself. I'm not over 2,000 yet, getting there, hopefully. So I can't speak from my personal experience, but from what I've asked from very strong players, most people think people can get to 2,000 just by focusing on not hanging their pieces, or letting their opponents just get away with the initiative. Is the Sicilian defense good? It's playable. I think if an opening has a name, it's usually playable, unless it's like the Grob or the Wandering King, kind of troll openings. What if queen to c7 or queen to b6? Did I cover those moves? Richard Dickinson is asking in the YouTube chat. Yes, I did cover queen to c7. Queen to c7 is a very interesting idea here, where it's going to kind of transpose to a Taimanov Sicilian, which we haven't covered, or at least I haven't covered on the channel. But if you look up any Taimanov systems, it's going to be very similar, but white is usually going to have more development because of just the weird transposition black makes, spending a few extra unnecessary moves to get a Taimanov. I seem too strong for 1537. Well, my USCF right now is 1650, but the last tournament I almost tied for first in a U18 against other 1800s. So while I would like to say I'm underrated, I mean, my rating's 1650. I'm going to say I'm 1650. Check back in with the Twitch chat. See if they have any more questions over here. Nope. All right. I'll take it over back to YouTube. There's still questions coming in, so I'm going to still keep this going. As soon as the questions start to dry up, we're going to wrap up the openings class. Would we get would we get deep into the martial attack and its variants? Also, thanks for all the knowledge. So the martial attack and its variants, that is something I do want to cover just because it is an opening that can just blow someone out of the water if they don't know what they're talking about. But I want to make sure that I'm really trying to get the best moves there for you, the best variations. It's been very heavily analyzed, I think almost to a draw, right? Every time, but I want to make sure I can get the full picture for everybody. I don't just want to be like, hey, here's the main line and deal with it, because realistically, if your opponent's below 1500, they're not going to play the main line all the way down. You need to make sure you understand all the sidelines as well and why those don't work. So the martial attack is something I want to try and get into for you guys. Okay, not seeing any more questions come through. We'll check Twitch chat one last time. Nothing over there. So I think we might be able to wrap this up early and move over to Twitch, where we'll start with the Winner's Circle. It's one of our new lectures here that I'm leading here. We're covering the tournament games of winners of famous tournaments in history or very important tournaments in history. Right now we're going over the 53 candidates tournament in Zurich, where we're looking at the games of Vasily Smyslov, who was a world champion and ended up winning this candidates tournament. One of the strongest tournaments of its time in history. This is going to be our second night. We're going to be looking at games 4 through 6. So make sure to join us over on twitch.tv/STL Chess Club for that. Thank you for stopping in for Openings Explained. We're going to move over to Twitch, get that lecture going for you guys. Have a good night.